Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Harrold. I'm the YaraVita product manager for the UK and Ireland. And today's webinar, we'll be looking at the foliar nutrition of potatoes and sugar beet. The webinar does attract a couple of CPD points, one for basis, one for Enroso, and those codes are there on the bottom of the screen for you. I will put those codes up again at the end of the webinar, just in case we have any people joining the webinar later during this broadcast. So what will we be covering today? We'll be starting off with a poll. Those of you that have joined our webinars this year, you'll be familiar with that approach. We've found that they're quite useful to get an idea about people's cropping, particularly this year with all the weather and the issues that's caused on farm. But also you may find those of interest to yourselves and the answers that we get back on those. So they won't take very long. That's just 3 short questions that we'll kick off with shortly. Then we'll talk about the basics of nutrition. I say this every time, when we talk about foliar application of nutrients, we can really only apply grams or hundreds of grams of a particular nutrient when we apply it foliarly. So it's important that we get the macronutrients of crop nutrition right. And it's no different for potatoes and sugar beet or any root crop for that matter. So we'll just go into a bit about that before we get straight into talking about particular crops requirement. Then we'll talk about potatoes. We'll go into some more details about the key nutrients through the growing season that are important to getting a successful crop of potatoes. We'll involve some of the trial work that we've done in potatoes, particularly in recent years, looking at the inclusion of biostimulants into the crop nutrition programs on potatoes, and where the YaraVita products fit in that crop nutrition program. Then we'll move on to talk about sugar beet in a little bit more detail. And for those of you that are growing or looking after fodder beet this season, a lot of the principles that we'll talk about with regard to sugar beet are just as relevant to fodder beet. Then we'll conclude with the key recommendations from ourselves for this coming season for those crops, and there will be a chance at the end to have a question and answer session. We have had some questions posed before the start of the webinar, but please feel free, if you've got any questions during the webinar, post those in the chat, and I will, time permitting, answer as many of those as I can at the end of the webinar. If for some reason we run out of time, then I will aim to get back to you on an individual basis with answers to the questions if you've posed them this evening. Okay, right, so without further ado, we will move on to the poll questions. So the first question, which I'll just open to you now, is, are you growing the same area of root crops this season? The same, more or less? So if I can just give you 30 seconds to answer that one when you've had a chance, and then we'll move on to the next question. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next one. Oh, hang on, there's just 1 or 2 of you still voting. Bear with you. Okay, right. Next question. Are you planning to use foliar nutrients on your root crops this season? Yes, no, or maybe. That's great, thank you. I think all of you have voted for that one. And the final one, are you planning to use biostimulants on your root crops this season? Yes, no, or maybe. Just a few more seconds and then we'll move on. Brilliant. I think that's everybody voted. So thank you for that. We'll come back to those a bit later on towards the end of the webinar, and I'll share what everybody's responses were to those. So moving on then. So talking about the basics, you'll have seen Liebig's barrel, his law of minimum before, I'm sure. Basically saying that you could get just about everything right, but if you've got one element that's not there in sufficient supply, you could potentially be compromising the yield of your crop. Now, of course, it's not all about nutrients, as you've seen on the image on the screen. It can be down to the soil conditions, weather conditions, availability of water, warmth, light, etc. They all play their part in a successful crop come the end of the season. But what we're talking about here is the macronutrients and the micronutrients of root crops. And what I want to really emphasize is that what we do with foliar nutrition is really sort of topping up the requirements of the crop to make sure we maximize its potential during the growing season. It's important to get all the basic things right first, and that I appreciate. Here we are, it's the 7th of May. A lot of crops are already in the ground. There are still crops to be planted. I appreciate that. But a lot of work will already have been done prior to establishing these crops. And that will mean things like soil sampling. It's important to do that to get an understanding about what you're dealing with when you're putting your crop nutrition plans together. Particularly in things like potatoes, quite often a grower of potatoes will be renting a field for 1 year to grow a crop of potatoes on. It's not a field that they're cropping every year. So having an understanding about what they're dealing with within that individual field, it's so important to get that information to help you formulate your crop nutrition plans with the best sort of information at hand. And you can see there, just looking at pH, for example, phosphorus, we know when the pH is high or it's rising above 7.5, 8 pH, it gets locked up by the calcium and therefore is less available to the growing crop. And the converse to that is when the pH declines and we start to become more acidic, then it gets locked up by aluminium and iron. So again, is less available for the crop. And we know that is the case with several other nutrients as well. Some of the micronutrients towards the bottom of the image there, manganese, boron, copper and zinc are all become or do tend to become less available as the pH rises. So they're all things that we need to take into account and sort of set ourselves up for success by making sure we have a good understanding about the field that we're growing this crop in for this season. And equally, I think it's important, again, I appreciate this will already have been done for this year, but as farmers and growers have become better able to use manures, organic manures these days, I think we used to treat them very much like waste products at one point, but I think for various factors, environmental concerns and the cost of buying in inorganic fertilizers in recent years, we've all become better equipped and we've got better understanding about using organic materials. And it's not just farmyard manures and slurries anymore, it's digestates, and also people are now making use of composts where they're combining several different materials together to make a more homogeneous product like a compost. but it's important to understand what that material is actually going to deliver to that crop. You know, we know we've got standard book values for a lot of organic materials, but in reality, that will vary considerably from one farm or one field to the next. So analysing that is quite important, I think, and I think we've got much better at doing that in recent years. Maybe what's a little bit more tricky still is to have a good understanding of what's actually going to be available. We can measure the total nutrients, but having a better than an estimate of what's actually going to be available to the crop in that growing year, particularly again on perhaps rented land with potatoes, it's so important to have a really good understanding of what the nutrients that are going to be available to that crop in that year are going to be. There are obviously various different types of analysis that you can do on those types of products. There can be just basic ones, testing the NPK, magnesium and dry matter, or you can do something that's a bit broader that includes the micronutrients and also the type of nitrogen or the form of nitrogen that might be present in that material as well. So that's another important area, which again, I appreciate for this year's probably already been done. What we can do in the season is analyse the crop itself. You know, how is it doing? And I think it's important that we don't just assume from one year to the next that that particular crop requires a certain application of a foliar nutrient. We've got the tools of analysis there to help us make a more informed decision. And obviously I've got there two images of potatoes, one of petioles and one of leaves, but the same principle of tissue analysis applies just the same to sugar beet crops as well. And it's important to, I think, take regular assessments during the season, particularly in a crop like potatoes, when you may well be going through the crop on a regular basis with a blight fungicide as part of a program. It gives you that opportunity to sample ahead of those applications and apply or add in foliar nutrition as the analysis suggests you should. And similar situations can be the case for sugar beet as well. So when you look at tissue analysis, so this is obviously for potatoes, samples that we've had sent into the land crop lab over 7 years here, just over 4,000 samples. You can see that there are on a regular basis particular nutrients showing up as being deficient on a regular basis. I haven't ignored it, but I haven't circled the nitrogen because I'm not aiming to talk too much about nitrogen today. It's the other elements, I think. And you can see here that in nearly 70% of the samples sent into the lab over those years have shown some level of deficiency with phosphate. Just over 40% were showing some level of deficiency with regard to potassium, and just over 60% were showing some level of deficiency with regard to boron. And boron seems to crop up in just about every tissue analysis we've seen at the lab in recent years, and it seems to be a nutrient that we need to perhaps be paying a little bit more attention to in all crops, not just the ones we're talking about today. Clearly on there are other nutrients that tend to show some level of deficiency, like magnesium, copper and zinc, and the others as well. But those three that I've just highlighted there, I think are ones that we ought to concentrate on in a little bit more detail. So if we look at phosphorus initially, a potato, and concentrating on potatoes here particularly, the yield of a potato crop is going to remove, or a ton of potatoes will remove around about 1 kilogram of phosphate from the soil. So obviously a high yielding crop removes more phosphate. But when you look at RB209's recommendation for phosphorus applications to potatoes, they don't suggest that you apply any more if your expected yield's above 50 tonnes to the hectare. They expect that some of that phosphate, if the yield isn't there to take it away, will go towards building the indices of the soil. But we know phosphate is critical to the success of a potato crop. It's necessary for tuber number, obviously for yield, because it's important during tuber bulking, and tuber uniformity as well. And we know that as you increase the amount of phosphate that's available to the crop, you do get an increase in tuber numbers. And for those of you that are growing seed crops of potatoes, obviously tuber number is absolutely important to you. And I'm sure you will be taking that into account when you put your nutrition plans together. But we know that the phosphate availability from the soil can be limited due to various factors. I highlighted it right at the start. pH has a big factor in the availability of phosphate. You know, the higher the pH, as I mentioned, the calcium starts to fix it up and lock it up. And then if you move in the other direction, as pH falls, becomes more acidic, firstly the aluminium fixes it up, and then the iron starts to fix phosphate up as well. So we know the pH has a big impact on the availability of phosphate. But so does soil temperature. You can see from the example on the right there that as soil temperature increases, the relative availability of phosphate also increases. Hopefully, as things are warming up outside now, that will be making a difference to potato crops that have already gone into the ground and will still be going into the ground. But we also know that if the root structure of the crop is compromised, it isn't very mobile in the soil, phosphorus, we know that. So relatively speaking, you would need more roots to take up the phosphate than you would, for example, need to take up the required amount of nitrogen. Nitrogen is clearly more mobile in the soil, and therefore will move towards the roots. The phosphate won't move towards the roots because it isn't mobile. Therefore, you would potentially need more root to take up that phosphate. So if the root structure has been compromised, if the seed bed the potatoes have been planted in has been less than ideal, which I appreciate in some cases is possibly the case this year given the wet weather, then that could be a limiting factor into how well the crop is supplied with phosphate this year. Moving on to potash. Unlike the phosphate, the potash requirement for potatoes is that much higher. If you're looking at the amount of offtake that a potato crop will make, it will remove nearer 6 kilograms per tonne of potassium from the soil than compared to the phosphate. And in the RB209 guidelines, they do suggest that yields above 50 tonnes to the hectare, you can increase or should increase the potassium that you apply to that crop by that rate. So another 10 tonne to the hectare of yield expected, then you would increase the potassium by another 60 kilos or thereabouts of potassium for that crop. Potassium will move through the soil profile as well, and where you've had heavy rain or you're using irrigation on potatoes, there is the potential to move some of that potassium through the soil profile, possibly away from the rooting zone. So that is something that's worth taking into account. And potassium availability is affected by those more acidic soils as well. Potassium in the crop itself is important for water regulation and cell turgor. So if you have got a situation where the crop is under a bit of water stress and the crop is lacking in potassium, then that is another area that maybe want to keeping an eye on. And foliar applications of potassium may be required to help rebalance that level in the crop. Moving on to look at magnesium now. Magnesium within the crop is very important. It's particularly shows on the older growth. And if you look at the imagery on the right of the screen there, you'll start to see magnesium deficiency on the older growth, the lower leaves within the canopy. And if the magnesium deficiency isn't corrected during the growing season, that will continue to get worse, and you'll get sort of like a premature senescence of those older lower leaves within the canopy. Magnesium is important, or an important component within chlorophyll. Therefore, if it's in short supply, you could be limiting or inhibiting the ability of the plant to photosynthesize. So we talk about applying magnesium to crops, not just potatoes, and keeping that crop greener for longer to help that photosynthetic capacity of the crop through the growing season. I just want to touch briefly on calcium. Calcium is an important element for potatoes. It's important for cell integrity. So I'm thinking of sort of tuber quality, reducing the chance of bruising, reducing storage rots, and in certain varieties, some are more prone to it than others, internal rust spot. Calcium is not a mobile nutrient. It's a notoriously immobile nutrient, and while you could apply a foliar application of calcium, and it can be done, in reality, you're not going to get the most out of that application. Calcium is better applied to the soil in a soluble form that the crop can take up, because calcium tends to move up the plant rather than down the plant. So in the case of those, if you've got a history of internal rust spot or issues around limiting amounts of calcium within the sites that you're growing potatoes on, then if you're looking for a solution to that, then it may be in the form of a soluble form of calcium nitrate. And within our range of products, that would be YaraVita Tropicoat, which is a fully soluble form of calcium nitrate that you would apply before or just around about tuber initiation. And it's a nitrogen calcium material. So I just wanted to mention that there. And the other element to mention here is boron. Boron and calcium deficiency can be mistaken because they look quite similar within the crop, and have sort of a link within the crop when it comes to internal rust spot. Boron is very mobile in the soil, and after all the wet weather we've had this year, it's maybe not going to be a surprise to find that boron deficiency is an issue this year. It'll have leached through the soil profiles, particularly on those lighter soils. We know that higher pH soils, those alkaline soils, limit the availability of boron as well. And it's not particularly mobile within the plant. So it may be that foliar applications of small amounts of boron may be relevant this year in potatoes. We don't need large quantities, but you may find that some is required. As if you just think back to the slide I showed of the tissue analysis results that the lab have had over those last 6-7 years, boron showed up in quite a number, or being deficient in quite a number of those samples that were sent in. So I think it is something we probably ought to be looking at in a little bit more detail now. So if we start to look at what our key product recommendations might be for potatoes this season, our go-to product would be Magphos K. As the name suggests, it contains magnesium, phosphorus and potassium. And if you're looking to increase tuber numbers, which you may well be doing in seed crops or possibly salad crops, our recommendation would be to apply 10 litres to the hectare when the 50% of the tips are twice the size of the stolon. In a wear crop, then we might be more looking towards a split approach, and in this case we'd be applying 2 applications of 5 litres of Magphos K 2 weeks apart. So you apply them with your blight fungicides 2 weeks apart once the tubers are over sort of 10 millimeters in size. And that's been a standard approach for us for a number of years and works very well. Now I'd just like to focus a little bit on the use of biostimulants in potatoes. We have a product called BioTrack, which has been available to us for a few years now, and we've been using it in potatoes and trial work since 2021. And we've got some useful data now on it and the improvement it's giving in marketable yield. BioTrack contains some nutrients. It contains some boron, some zinc, nitrogen and potassium, but also some organic carbon as well. It's a formulated product containing bioactive components from Ascophyllum nodosum, which is basically seaweed algae, some organic acids and vitamins. And we know from BioTrack that it can help enhance tolerance to abiotic stresses, so things like heat stress, moisture stress, etc. And even in some crops, the impact that herbicides can have on the crop. And the composition of the product can also help in many of the plant processes that could subsequently result in higher yields and quality as well. So I want to just share with you some of the trial work that we've done with BioTrack over recent years and show you how it could fit into your programs. So as I said, we started with it in 2021, but it wasn't until 2022 that we had a replicated trial. So this is a replicated trial from 2 years ago in some Maris Piper. And you can see we applied 2 timings during tuber bulking, and our first treatment was Magphos K applied twice, which, as I said, is our sort of go-to approach in potatoes. We applied it with BioTrack at 2 litres at both timings, and BioTrack on its own at both timings. And just for completeness, we also included mancozin in that trial as well. And you can see from the yield data, the sort of 45-60 mil size in the orange bar untreated, in the light green bar, the addition of those 2 treatments of Magphos K did increase yield. And where we included the BioTrack in the blue bar, there was a further step up in yield from the inclusion of the BioTrack. BioTrack on its own, 2 litres applied twice, you can see also in comparison gave us a similar yield to the Magphos K on its own. The mancozin itself was a little bit behind on the marketable yield result in that trial. Also in 2022, we had a sort of a small plot trial at whole crop marketing site that year, this time in a crop of Melody. The treatments weren't as wide in this case. It was simply looking at untreated versus Magphos K applied twice versus Magphos K and the BioTrack applied twice. And the results from that were not dissimilar to the ones I've just shown you in the replicated work. There was a clear yield increase in the marketable brackets with the Magphos K, and the inclusion of the BioTrack gave us a further lift in that trial as well. And finally, in that year, we also had a split field trial in Yorkshire with the crop of Melody again. And this time it was just the BioTrack applied on its own, but at this time 3 litres to the hectare was applied. And when we did the yield digs later on in the season, there was around about a 12% yield increase from applying those 2 applications of the BioTrack. And we also had a split field trial in Scotland that year as well on the variety Marabelle, same as the Yorkshire site, 2 applications of Biotrack at 3 litres to the hectare. And again, there was a difference in yield where the Biotrack had been applied. In this case, the crop had obviously been allowed to grow on to be a bigger fraction, because we were in a 60 to 80 mil range there. So if we just pull all of those Biotrack trials into one slide from 2022, there are 11 different trials, including that replicated work that year. And you can see in the blue bar on the right of the screen, the overall yield benefit from that year from using the Biotrack was 3.5% yield increase. If you just take the unirrigated crops, that's the green bars, you can see that the yield benefit was 5.7%. But unusually, if you just take the irrigated fields, those in the red, there was actually a negative impact on yield. Now, if you just said to me, what would you have expected from a trial or a series of trials that year? 2022 was quite warm, quite hot in fact during some points in the season, and quite dry. Then yes, you would have perhaps have expected a positive result from using a biostimulant in potatoes that year. But what I wouldn't have expected is to see a negative impact in an irrigated crop. Yes, the irrigated crop, the crop would be under less stress because of the ability to manage the water within the crop. So therefore, perhaps not a positive result, but I can't explain why we got a negative result in those 3 fields that year. We are going to repeat this work in 2024 this year. Unfortunately, our replicated work in 2023 was not taken through to harvest due to the season, unfortunately. But what we did do last year was some more split field work, albeit, I'll have to say, in unirrigated crops. So this is a crop of Challenger in Shropshire last year, where we applied 2 applications of Biotrack at 3 litres to the hectare, and we got a sensible lift in yield that year in that crop, about 11-to-1 return on investment in that crop. Another unirrigated crop, this time Melody again in Yorkshire last year, again a nice uplift in yield from those 2 applications of the Biotrack, giving us a return on investment of 13-to-1. So I think there does seem to be a bit of a trend in that the biostimulant element is giving us a yield response in those unirrigated crops. So if you just put that into a plan or our sort of core recommendation for potatoes for this season, then the Magphos K would be the key element. Either apply 10 litres just after tuber initiation in crops where tuber number is important, or in where crops where tuber size is more relevant, then 2 applications of 5 litres of Magphos K during tuber bulking. And where we've seen a benefit from including it, the Biotrack applied twice at the same time as the Magphos K at 2 litres to the hectare. I've mentioned just in the top of the slide there about using tissue and PTO analysis. I do think that is an important management tool for potatoes. You've got that regular pass through the crop for blight control, so you've got that ability to sample or test the crop regularly through the season and make an informed decision about what nutrient requirements the crop may require as you're going through next time with the sprayer. So that sort of brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about on potatoes. Moving on to sugar beet now. And as I said at the start, I think for those of you that may be more interested in fodder beet, or you're looking after fodder beet crops this year, a lot of what I've got about to say on sugar beet is just as relevant to fodder beet crops. With the delay to planting spring crops of all sorts this spring, clearly because of the prolonged wet weather. It's going to be absolutely crucial to maximize the canopy of sugar beet in the next six weeks. The longest day is not that far away, about 6 weeks, and we need to think about the canopy like a solar panel, intercepting that solar radiation and transferring that energy it's captured into the roots for optimizing the sugar yield. So ensuring that canopy is built quickly to utilize that summer sunshine is absolutely crucial. And during that period, we need to make sure that there's no nutrient deficiencies. And just to sort of re-emphasize that point, you can see here it's a straight line response. The more intercepted radiation there is, you basically get more sugar yield, more tons to the hectare of sugar. And that's basically the point I'm just emphasizing here, really. The key nutrients I want to put a bit more detail on today are boron, magnesium and manganese. Not to say that zinc, copper and sulfur are any less important, but I think when you look at tissue analysis, again, the boron, the magnesium and the manganese seem to be the ones that crop up more regularly. But I will mention where the zinc and the copper and also sulfur can play their part as well. So when you look at micronutrient removal of sugar beet, you can see here I've just based these figures on a yield of 75 tons to the hectare. If you're yielding more than that, clearly you're going to remove more of those nutrients per hectare. So boron, for example, that crop would remove about 450 grams to the hectare of boron, around about 68 grams of copper, 525 grams or thereabouts of manganese, 4.5 grams of molybdenum. We know we don't need a lot of molybdenum in crops, but it shows that you do need a little bit. And finally, zinc, very similar figures to the amount of manganese that you'd remove with that crop of sugar beet. Boron, I've already touched on boron when we talked about potatoes. It's very mobile in the soil, and on those lighter sandy soils, the likelihood is that the reserves of boron in those soils will have been affected by the heavy rain or the prolonged rainfall that we've had this year. It's also not particularly mobile in the plant itself. I know you can apply boron to the soil prior to drilling, but you've also got plenty of opportunity to apply foliar applications of boron to sugar beet during the growing season. It's important to reduce heart rot, and clearly it's important for yield and ultimately sugar yield as well. Magnesium, as I've said for potatoes, magnesium is absolutely essential for or an essential component of chlorophyll, and therefore maximizing the photosynthetic capacity of the crop. If we're going to get try and make up for some of the lost time for later established crops, we must make sure that those crops are not lacking in any of those key nutrients going into the next 6 to 8 weeks. And magnesium's no different. And it's absolutely crucial. The photograph there on the right of the screen, the only difference between those two plants is the fact the one on the left hasn't had any magnesium. It's had everything else that the plant on the right has had. It just hasn't had any magnesium. And you can see particularly the older leaves on that left-hand plant looking sicker than the younger leaves. So it's important that we make sure that there's plenty of magnesium available, and it's just as important later on in the season as well, keeping that crop greener for longer so it maximizes that solar radiation, intercepting that sunlight for as long as it can. Manganese, I think it's an issue on those lighter sandy soils, those lower cation exchange capacity soils. we all know where those hot spots are in fields, or those fields that are in that category. And I think I always say to people about manganese, don't delay treating it. It's not something that you really want to let get out of hand. You can't get that foliage back once manganese has taken it away. So don't delay manganese treatment. If you know you've got a particular issue, make sure you get on and treat it as soon as you can. It's also an issue in alkaline soils. We know that as well, and I mentioned that at the start. And also in seed beds that maybe on the fluffy side haven't been consolidated, again because of the weather. It could be an issue in the crop's ability to take up manganese this year. So I'll come back to the products again, but the main product that we would recommend in sugar beet is Brachytrol Pro. It has those three elements that I've just mentioned: the boron, the magnesium, and the manganese. It's a very easily tank mixable product with other applications that you may be going through sugar beet with, and the same would apply for fodder beet just as well. And you can see again, similar picture to what I just showed before, but this time the plant on the left has had some magnesium. It's had about 25% of what it should have had, but no boron, manganese, or molybdenum, whereas the plant on the right has been treated with Brachytrol Pro at the 4 true leaf stage, and you can see it's much bigger and looking a lot healthier than the plant on the left. Just want to mention copper and also zinc. As I said at the start of this section on sugar beet, maybe not as critical, but still have a part to play if you've got particular issues around copper and zinc deficiency on your soils. Then don't delay treating those. A product like Mancozin contains manganese, copper, and zinc, and can, at relatively low rates, help issues regarding those particular nutrients. And finally, I wanted to mention sulfur. Sulfur within sugar beet, a 75 ton to the hectare sugar beet crop may well take up 75 kilograms of sulfur, and half of that will be in the leaves, and another half of that will be in the roots. But I think we probably give sulfur enough coverage now in macronutrient applications. But if you find after this year, again, because of the fact that the sulfur has leached through the soil profile due to all the wet weather we've had, it may be that you find there are some sulfur deficiencies in crops this year. It's important for nitrogen utilization, we know that, and it's an important component of proteins and enzymes as well. And we can apply foliar applications of products that contain sulfur, and I'll come on to those in a moment. So just putting those into, just so that you can see the relative nutrients that are in those at those field applied rates. I've already mentioned the Brachytrol Pro, and if you apply 3 litres, you can see the grams per hectare that would apply to the crop. The Mancozin I've just mentioned, obviously applying manganese, copper, and zinc. But if you've got a concern around the sulfur that I've just mentioned, then an alternative product might be Fotrol Pro at 3 kilograms to the hectare. It's a soluble powder product, but it contains boron, magnesium, and manganese, but a useful quantity of sulfur as well. If sulfur is just what you're concerned about, or you recognize or find that you've got a sulfur deficiency in your sugar beet crop later on in the season, then you could always apply Thiotrac. Thiotrac at 3 litres to the hectare will deliver a useful quantity of sulfur and some nitrogen at the same time. So they're just a few options that you might find have a place during the season this year. Coming on to Biotrac now in sugar beet, I've mentioned this product in potatoes. We've also had some useful success with using it in sugar beet as well. and we will continue to look at biotracking sugar beet again this year. I just wanted to share this result from some replicated work done in France a few years ago when the product was first going through development. This was 2 trials applied at 2 different timings. The first was at 6 true leaves at 3 litres to the hectare, and then again 6 weeks later. And there were 4 replicates of these particular trials. And when you look at the mean of those 4 trials, there was just over a 4 tonne to the hectare yield increase. And if I value the beet at £40 a tonne, that gave us a margin over input cost of £120 to the hectare, and around about 3 to 1 return on investment from those 2 applications of biotrack. This was some work done in Suffolk 2 years ago, 2022. There was a failure of the original crop, so it was resown towards the end of May, and an application of biotrack was made to the crop on the 20th of June, 3 litres to the hectare, about 11 days before a herbicide was applied. And then a second application of biotrack was made to this crop at the beginning of August. We also had in that split field trial an alternative, a competitor biostimulant product as well. What was interesting when we looked at the foliage between the different treatments, the leaves of the sugar beet that had had the biotrack applied prior to the herbicide application looked a lot healthier, as you can see on the left of the screen. The untreated, or the ones that didn't get the biotrack but did get the herbicide, you can see there seemed to be much more of an effect on the plant itself from that herbicide application. So that sort of goes back to what we were saying about the biostimulants helping the crop overcome or be less stressed by those abiotic stress elements, in this case the herbicide. So that was taken through to sort of a harvest, and the local British Sugar area manager did the yield digs and assessments on that. And you can see where the single application of biotrack was made, the adjusted yield was 70.48 tonnes. With the second application applied at the beginning of August, that adjusted yield was increased further still. And when you put some financial figures onto that, that single application gave us a 8.38 tonne to the hectare yield increase over the untreated, which gave us a margin over input cost of just over £300 to the hectare, again with the sugar beet valued at £40 to the tonne. Where the 2 applications were applied, one in June and that latter one in August, you can see we got a step in yield again, and in this case the margin over input cost rose to over £500 to the hectare and just over an 11 to 1 return on investment. So that again would suggest to me that that's where the biostimulant products have their place. If the crop is under some form of stress or likely to be under some form or put under some form of stress, the inclusion of the biostimulant will help that crop better able to stand that stress effect. So if you're to look at that in a program, our core recommendation would be to use 3 litres to the hectare of Brassitrol Pro at the 4 to 6 true leaf stage, and include 3 litres to the hectare of Biotrack, and consider a second application of that later on in the season to continue that influence on the crop being able to withstand abiotic stress impacts. And as I say, we will be continuing our work in potatoes and sugar beet with Biotrack this year. So that's sort of bringing me towards the end of the slides before we move into the Q&A. But just to give you a summary, the take-home messages from today would be, as I started out today's webinar, getting the basics right first. I think Obviously, some of that's already been done for this year, but I do think it's important taking that sort of programmed approach to your crop nutrition of root crops. Understand what's in the soil to start with, understand what's available in any applied organic manures, and then during the season, tissue analysis to help you make an informed decision about what the crop might be needing as you go through. But getting those macronutrients right from the start is absolutely critical, because all we can do with foliar applications is basically top up small quantities that may be helpful. So in potatoes, if you're looking to influence tuber numbers, then 10 litres to the hectare of Magphos K would be our recommendation round about tuber initiation. The BioTrack application at 2 litres to hectare has shown to give us some yield increase by helping aid tolerance to abiotic stress. And by that, I mean, I think we've seen from the results I've shown you, particularly in those unirrigated crops where there's perhaps a water stress element at play. And where we're looking at actually increasing yield during tuber bulking, then our recommendation would be to apply 5 litres to the hectare of Magphos K twice. And then finally, in the sugar beet, as I've just talked to you about, our core recommendation is 3 litres to the hectare of Brassitrol Pro, applied at 4 to 6 true leaves. Supplies all those key nutrients in one can, making it a very user-friendly product. And you can also apply BioTrack, in this case 3 litres to the hectare twice, giving an increase in yield and in tolerance to those abiotic stresses, which in sugar beet could be late applied herbicides or again lack of moisture in the crop itself. So thank you for that. That brings me to the end of the slides. But if you do have any more questions, please, I'll put my details up there on the screen. Hopefully you can see those. And again, for those of you that maybe didn't get them, the basis and Enroso point codes are there for you as well. I will get back to the person who asked about the other biostimulant products that we had in the sugar beet trial once I've found what that is out. But please, yeah, if you've got any more questions, please drop me a line. My mobile number's on there, but also my email address. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for taking the time to join the webinar today. I know there's still an awful lot of work going on out there at the moment because of the delay to planting sugar beet and potatoes. And I know there's still a lot of fodder beet to get planted as well. But I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And it just remains for me to say good luck with the rest of your season with regard to your crops, whichever ones you're growing. And if you need any more information, please do get in touch. But thank you very much.